Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jane Preston, Managing Director of Poets House, a library and meeting place that welcomes everyone into this home for poetry. I'm so grateful to Laura for bringing you all here today to remember Annie. Annie Wright, who was so dear to me personally, and who played such an outsized role in the life of Poets House. A close friend of our founder, Elizabeth Cray. Annie Wright was among our founding board members. A devoted teacher, she helped to create our children's room all the way back on Spring Street and worked with staff to envision dynamic, engaging programs for young people, introducing us to Richard Lewis, who I'm so happy to see today. Later, when she was no longer on the board and we had moved to this place, she came often to volunteer her time and work with Mike Romanos in the children's room, passionately devoted to helping us make a space for poetry in the lives of young people. Personally, I've never been comfortable with kids. But nonetheless, Annie played an outsized role in my life as well. There she was, so proper seeming and almost schoolmarmish, but blessed with bright, clear vision, a tongue that never wagged but was always surprisingly forthright, and a bottomless sense of fun. Though I couldn't share her love of kids, we did share something else so important to me, a love of the natural world and its creatures, and spent many, many joyful hours together searching those out. I'll never forget a night that seemed to last forever, when she and I, having swum all day in the salt ponds surrounding her seaside cottage in Rhode Island, sat on the beach, drinking scotch, of course, from our thermos, of course, watching the full moon rise and ride across the sky, talking quietly as the night wore away. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Sandy Zulauf, poet, teacher, editor, always poet, teacher, editor, and dear friend of both James and Annie.
This room is full. Thank you, Jane, and thank all of you as guests of Poets House this evening, and especially for your kindness to us for this celebration of Annie's long and well-lived life. That's enough. No, I'm kidding. Annie was a devoted, endangered piping plover protector on the Misquamicut beaches near Westerly, Rhode Island, that Jane just painted a beautiful picture of for us. And she rented her summer cottage a short walk from the ocean. Today I'm pleased to welcome us all as Annie's last brace or wing of piping plovers. We first acknowledge her family members. If you could just raise your hand so people can perhaps find you. Laura Lee and Greg DeCinque, they're back in near the food. Annie was devoted to her beloved niece and her nephew-in-law, who live in Western New York State and had a 9-hour drive here. Karen East is also hiding behind Greg. And she's Annie's niece from Casper, Wyoming. Annie's nephew, Robin East, and his future wife, Brenda, are here from Arizona. And Carrie Tuttle, also next to Laura, is Annie's cousin who lives here in New York City. And there are special guests all throughout this room, but I'd just like to point out a man who was incredibly helpful in publishing James's work posthumously, and that's Jonathan Galassi at Farrar, Straus and Giroux. I'll be introducing Annie's friends who have generously offered their thoughts and the bell beats of their voices this evening. Ma la brava gente canta per non piangere. But the good people sing in order not to weep. Stephanie Pryor is here, and she's the daughter of Annie's lifelong friend, Nancy Sales Everts. And there was a photo of Nancy in the remembrance up there. Nancy was one of the most delightful people I've ever met. She met Annie at Wheelock College in Boston, a pioneer of early childhood education. Nancy is the friend whom Annie moved to Rhinebeck to be with. So here is Nancy's daughter, Stephanie Pryor.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Pryor, and as Sandy just told you, I am one of Nancy Sales Everett's children, and hence have known Dee Dee Runk my whole life. In the Pryor family, Annie is forever known by her name in college, and we have steadfastly refused to conform to her subsequent name changes. Dee Dee Runk. We never shortened it to Dee Dee. She went to Wheelock College and became fast friends with my mother, and they stayed in touch throughout their lives, nearly becoming roommates at the end of their lives when they lived down the hall from each other at Arbor Ridge. My earliest memory of Dee Dee Runk was waking her up at our home with my sister Alex to sell her potholders we had made and were eagerly selling at $0.25 apiece. She would obligingly buy one from each of us, and so she ingratiated herself to us early on. As I got older and more politically aware, I was very impressed by her volunteering to go on the bus to the Deep South and help to register voters who were being disenfranchised. She was definitely a sort of cool aunt who really lived life and traveled to other countries, inspiring me to do the same as I grew up. And she was cheering me on as I moved from Scotland to Cameroon, reassuring my mother I would be all right. As we Pryors grew up and had children, Dee Dee would visit us and stayed in touch with our children through a special club they had. She had a special knack with children, and not surprising given her career. She quickly made friends with several of our preteen children by starting the SWOTY Club with them and challenging us parents to stop it. SWOTY standing for Swear Word of the Year. And they would mail back and forth what the word was. She would later, much later, welcome my oldest daughter into her home while she was student teaching at the international school, and they got along very well, except Ariadne had to go to the local Barnes & Noble's bookstore to be able to access her grad classes that were online in the evening. As we all know, Dee Dee refused to jump on the digital bandwagon, much to our consternation, hence the need to keep up a small snail mail correspondence with her. Dee Dee was especially fond of my brother Rob, and he of her. He recalls being at home when my mom had gone off to work, and Dee Dee had come to visit and needed to catch a bus back to New York City that would stop at the end of the street we lived on, but was about a half-mile away. So being up for a new adventure, she gratefully accepted a ride on the back of Rob's motorcycle to the bus stop and loved to remind us of this. She also traveled to Switzerland with my mother for the christening of my brother Rob's daughter, Katerina, and planned a side trip to Italy via train. Rob stopped by the train station after they missed their train as they were buzzing around the train station in a panic. He came and suggested that they buy new tickets and take the next train. They looked at him and said, "Oh," and off they went to Italy, so Dee Dee could show our mother some of her beloved Italian towns where she had shared some of her best times with James. Rob also recalled she had an eye for beauty and once in Switzerland insisted they stop the car so she could take a picture of an espalier tree growing on the side of a building. She was always so smiley and ready to make you laugh, but could swivel on a dime and talk about something serious. With that soothing voice, with perfect diction, it makes total sense she married a poet. My sister Eleanor recalls when she became a priest, the unreligious Dee Dee self-appointed herself Elle's godmother, reverently irreverent. At the end of our mother's life, we were all very grateful when Dee Dee moved into Arbor Ridge. She immediately engaged with the other residents and all the activities available and insisted our shy mother go for dinner in the dining room with her every evening. She even arranged for a different set of dinner companions every night, much to Mom's delight, and helped her to make new friends. After dinner, Mom and Dee Dee would then retire to Mom's apartment to watch a British comedy and drink vodka, and had a unique saying when they parted ways at the end of the evening, and gleefully shared with us, lest we think they had become two staid old ladies. "Keep your pecker up." And I would say our beloved Dee Dee did just that to the end.
Bill Epps is the elder son of Annie's dearest friends from Wheelock, Carol and Mickey Epps, and he's a poet, a former minister, and a retired English and science teacher living in Brooklyn. Bill remembers how his Aunt Annie's unconditional love and kindness freely flowed into his life, crossing generations of friendship. Carolyn and Bill's dad, Morgan, often hosted James and Annie in their Buffalo, New York home. Bill Epps.
Thank you. It's amazing to see those photographs and realize the only ones that came through, and I wasn't able to provide any of my family who would be here, certainly in spirit and in love for Annie and her life. We had quite a 1970s look. That was a little much. So anyway, this feels like the right place, the absolute right place. For those who know, that was very special and very important. So, and I wanted to say tell a couple of stories about Buffalo and meeting James for the first time, the first poet I ever met in my life, who really changed kind of my direction. And also Annie as taking care of me as a kid in the back seat of a car as my mother would drive us to places and do games. Some of them familiar to those of us of a certain generation. How many license plates can you pick out from different states? And then the one that came up that was absolutely marvelous, and I don't know who coined it, but I claim at least partial thing with those huge bulbous Rubenesque cars from the 1950s and 60s full of chrome were fat cars, and to a little kid that was magical. So and just a moment of glimpse to my father briefly first. My father and I, after I moved to New York, which was not expected, and I'll return to that briefly, went to Carnegie Hall. He's a complete classical music lover. We were up in the nosebleed seats, way up. And my father's not a poet, never considered himself that. And all of a sudden, at the end of, as intermission came up, he said, James Wright's poem is in me right now. And it ends with, I've wasted my life. And it took my breath away as his son, thinking, oh my God, Dad is saying this, but even more meaningfully, that had been absorbed by my non-poet father. So poetry matters, of course. James Wright was one of my favorite poets, right up at the top. And again, the first poet I ever met, and I want to tell you a little bit of that story. So James and Annie come, and obviously the connection with my mother being the third of the trio at Wheelock of friends. James took my Simon & Garfunkel record and played it to death. I was a little that was a little cringy, but what he did with it and talking about what he heard in those lyrics was wonderful. And to a young man, that meant a lot. The other thing was remarkable, was kind of scary too, and I don't know where James was with his transition to sobriety, but I suspect it was in between. But James was kind of a scary man to me at that time. And one of the scariest things he did was he brought a poem down to breakfast when we were all together, and then James and Annie were going to be in that in our house for the summer, or for a month in the summer while he was at the University of Buffalo. And James comes down and he announces, I've written a poem. It's in dactylic hexameter. And until I taught English and understood that, it was kind of terrifying. And then got to know him through his work. You know, Annie herself, who I knew as Edie Runk, but was really my Aunt Annie, you know, in addition to the back seat of the car entertainment, she was always just so loving and so there. And as a lot of us, I think, sometimes feel, you know, when our mothers or our fathers can't give us everything that we need in the world, we sometimes find others. And Annie, for me, was like a second mother. She didn't have any kids of her own at the time, but just so loving and so unconditional in that. You know, she also was coining, you know, along with Fat Car, she also coined or would lace literature into everyday speech. And one of those was, I was dating a woman who I unfortunately broke up with, but she was to Annie fair Julia. Julie was, it was kind of, she was teaching. She was a teacher. So the other person that Annie introduced me to, and I wasn't sure of Annie's intentions, but she introduced me to David Ignato's daughter, Yedi, a wonderful poet in her own right. David Ignato being an absolutely marvelous poem to me as a young man growing up. And I got to know Yedi a little bit, and she was the one who pointed out, oh, you were really, really moved by James, weren't you? And I said, yes, absolutely. Felt like I wear that around my neck. So later in high school, I wrote a poem that won an award. That was kind of a turning point for me as a young man. Looking back on it, it very closely resembled The Jewel. And for those of you who don't know that poem, I recommend you go read it. And I thought to myself at the time, oh my gosh, I've plagiarized this poem. And then later realized, no, this was what grew out of my reading of James Wright's poem. So I'm going to end with an anecdote that I just, because the Epps family were important to James and Annie in our way, and they were so important to my life and to the Epps family. I wanted to bring my siblings. I have one sibling, a younger brother, who still lives in Buffalo, basically around the corner from the house where James and Annie visited. And he said, I have one story, but it's really not about Annie. Hear it and see and decide for yourself. He said that when Annie and James were staying in her house, and he was working on the translations of Hermann Hesse. That was what the work was at the time. And my father drove my brother in from where we were staying on the Canadian shore to Buffalo so that my brother could cut the grass. And supposedly, James Wright said to Annie, according to Annie, if Charlie can come all the way in here to cut the grass, I can get up and get back to work. The point being, that might have been a lost story. Who told it to my brother but Annie? Very loving, very loving. We miss you, Annie, and feel your spirit here. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And Josh Lines grew up next door to Annie. I saw you when you were about that big. At 529 East 85th Street. She tutored him and babysat for him, and she called herself his unofficial godmother. Josh Lines.
Hello, everybody. I am Josh, and I did grow up in the apartment across the hall from Annie. She occupies some of my earliest memories, and I'm told that she met me within days of my birth. My parents were friends with her before I was born. For some context, I was born in 1980 to working parents, which made me what is now known as a latchkey kid. If I wasn't home after school with my grandmother, I was almost surely across the hall at Annie's apartment, or possibly at the local playground with her. Annie was, as I imagine you all know, one of the kindest and most thoughtful people I've had the good fortune to come across in my life. Beyond her caring nature, she was determined to enrich my life as much as possible. There was never a TV on at Annie's house when I came over. We didn't do TV. We read books, we played board games, we went to museums, and we worked on my schoolwork. Thank God, because if not for that, I'm not sure that I would have made it through. She was responsible for my first rebellious political action at the age of about 6, 7, which took the form of writing something along the lines of, "Oliver North is a jerk," in colorful chalk on the sidewalk outside of our building, to my parents' chagrin. I didn't know who Oliver North was, of course, or what he had done, but I could tell that Annie was serious about this one. Years later, looking back, I can't help but to agree wholeheartedly. Annie was one of the strong women that shaped my childhood, grimly determined that I understand the world and be prepared for it, and somehow always managing to deliver the lessons with kindness and caring. She loved her family intensely and told me stories about them and, of course, her beloved James, the kind which I hope my own wife would tell about me in the same scenario. I'm grateful that she got to meet my wife through letters and my son through pictures. And sadly, our trip to see her didn't materialize in time. That said, my son will surely benefit from her lessons as I did. The world seems less bright for her absence, and I will miss her dearly. Thank you.
Miss her dearly. I agree. Donna Massini was a good friend of Annie and James. She's written excellent books, 4 of them, excellent books of poetry filled with her extraordinary energy, including Did You Find Everything You Were Looking For? And 4:30 Movie. Her poems appear in the New Yorker, APR, Poetry, and many, many others. She's currently professor of English at Hunter, where she was fortunate enough to study with James Wright. Donna Massini.
Hey everyone, so happy to be here. All right. In my office at Hunter College, adjacent to room 1222, the James Wright Memorial Library, where we have all our grad classes, I have beside my desk James Wright's brown leather briefcase. How did it come to be there? Back in the 70s, James Wright was my teacher. If you took his classes over and over, as many of us did, you'd hear about his beloved Annie. Once, after he'd been away for a year, I went up after class to say I was happy to see him. I asked about Annie. Annie, he gleefully declared, had gained 20 pounds on pastries. I don't remember if they're Viennese or Venetian. It was 20 pounds. A few years after his death, Annie published The Delicacy and Strength of Lace, letters between James Wright and Leslie Marmon Silko. I read Annie's introduction. I devoured the letters in one sitting, and I don't know how, in those pre-Google days, I found her address, but I wrote her. Days later, my husband Judd, now my ex-husband, called to say there was a letter from Annie in our post office box. I ran to Prince Street, to the Prince Street station, and there her beautiful, gracious letter inviting me for coffee. At Panna Cioccolato, near NYU where I was in grad school, we started out by trading stories about her James and my Professor Wright. I must have told her that Professor Wright and I shared a birthday, December 13th. This I'd learned on the back cover of This Journey, which Annie had published posthumously. We soon found our own way. I began to learn about Annie, her teaching, her favorite students, how James Wright had visited her class and sat at the really big guy, at this little tiny table of kindergarten kids. I asked her about her sculpture, which was on the cover of the collected poems. She talked often about Laura, their beloved niece. Annie was the first person to take me to see the Neapolitan Christmas tree at the Met, which we were to visit or try to visit every year, coinciding with the birthday. And when Poets House sent me to Newdorp Library on Staten Island for Poetry in the Branches, Annie came with me. She met my parents, my Aunt Terry. Now she was family. In fact, Annie was born on February 23rd, my sister's birthday, so this all felt sort of inevitable. Soon, she would invite me and Judd to her apartment on 85th Street, where she cooked us ossobuco, assuming I loved it, that it was a special treat. In fact, I'd never heard of it and didn't eat meat, but I ate it. It was Annie. Annie would go away from time to time to a mysterious place called Misquamicut. For years, we had a lively correspondence while she was out there or out visiting Laura and Greg. God, I miss letters. We sent so many letters. If I could have climbed up my rickety ladder to find them, I would have read these things to you in her elegant prose, but I have to rely on memory here. Annie, trying to learn how to drive. Annie, not only getting her license, something I've never managed to do, but actually driving. Annie's crush on Dexter Gordon. Who remembers that? Annie's crush on Dexter Gordon after we both saw Around Midnight. She had such a crush on him. He reminded her of James Wright. Soon, Judd and I had our first visit to Misquamicut. We went to the beach, we saw the terns, we walked to Watch Hill. We laughed and laughed and laughed. I now know much, much more about birds than I ever expected I would. But Annie was the first person in my life to look up from coffee, quite casually, and say, Carolina wren, black-capped chickadee, just from the sound. Different birds made different sounds. Imagine. And always we left the cottage with a small bunch of sweet peas from Annie's garden. The thing about Annie, she was fiercely loyal. I think we all have maybe a loyalty story about Annie. Fiercely loyal, deeply supportive. Even when I wrote things she found a bit questionable, maybe she herself wouldn't have been quite so revealing, she always found something to support and love. It was because of Annie I was invited with Robert Creeley to speak at the James Wright Poetry Festival in Martins Ferry, Ohio, where she and I walked through that town and visited the famous Shreve High football stadium. It was an amazing trip. It was an extraordinary honor. And of course, being Annie, it was wildly fun and funny. The last time Annie visited my office at Hunter, she brought me the briefcase and a small loose-leaf binder James Wright had used to keep his poem notes. I just listened to about 8 years of saved phone messages, mostly birthday, from Annie. Here's the thing. Annie and I met because of James Wright. We became friends and stayed friends because of Annie. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Lee Brussetti is a poet who served as the executive director of Poets House from 1989 to 2021. Four-Way Books published her books of poems, most recently Blue Guide. Annie would often speak fondly of all the good works they accomplished together. Lee Brussetti.
Hi, everybody. Oops. Before I met her, Annie made a vivid impression on me. At a James Wright reading, probably 1978, surely the Guggenheim, when James invited her to the stage to thank her for being, oops, let me see how I'm going to go back. When James invited her to the stage to thank her for being his saving companion and muse. I had never seen anything like this, a life and death intimacy in the midst of a crowd. I didn't yet know James Wright's poems, but what touched me was Annie's tremendous excitement as she got on stage. How pretty she was, and how intensely shy she was. She was holding a boxy pocketbook by its handle, and her shyness was in the slope of her shoulders in a little skirt suit as she clutched the handle of that pocketbook so tightly. By 1989, when I became executive director of Poets House, I had read James Wright's poetry and knew Annie was poetry royalty. She was on the board of the relatively young Poets House and had been a devoted friend of Elizabeth Cray's, Betty, who, along with Stanley Kunitz, were co-founders of the organization, and this is the Elizabeth Cray room. You'll hear tonight, and you have heard, that she was a devoted teacher specializing in preschool and early childhood education. Our first project together was at a conference, was to put together a conference for New York City English teachers supporting the teacher of poetry in the home economics room of the High School for the Humanities. Do you remember that first long ago space? As Poets House evolved, Annie was part of the team suggesting educational programs, and right after 9/11, as Poets House doubled its space at 72 Spring Street, Annie helped brainstorm the Children's Poetry Room, a cutie pie space the size of a big walk-in closet, festooned with books, a shag rug, a 4-foot teddy bear children sat on, and origami paper cranes dangling from the ceiling. Annie led weekly Tiny Poets events for preschoolers with her beloved Mike Romanos, a Poets House staff member. There were songs, there were poems, there was her intrinsic belief in the poetic spirit in every curious child, and her belief that early exposure to poetry was important for intellectual and emotional development. Annie helped to develop educational programs in this space, too. For years, she led weekly gatherings for tiny poets, as well as class trips to the space after Poets House opened here in 2009. She worked so closely with Richard Lewis. I'm so glad to see you. Years of devoted volunteer time. Although my work with Annie was firmly rooted in this place for poetry, the secret sauce of the friendship was Italian. I was born in Italy, and we talked about Italy and our shared places frequently. Verona, Venice, Assisi, Rome. I believe Annie had her happiest life adventures in Italy with James. We shared Italy, opera, an interest in butterflies, and as I got to know her, I learned that that pulled-together, measured lady had a ribald sense of humor and a taste for an elegant highball. She had restraint and good manners, but boy, Annie also had good timing for a great retort. And of course, she was the link to an epic in American poetry with gossipy, well-meaning but gossipy, stories about Galway Canal, James Dickey, Hayden Carruth, who lived on the street I grew up on before he went to Vermont, Robert Bly and her close friends Adrienne Rich, Jane Cooper, Jean Valentine, and of course Betty. Even in her last years in Rhinebeck, Annie loved to share news of poets who kept in touch. Billy Collins called, and she reported updates about her work in support of James's poetry. Finally, that's something else we shared, the responsibility of supporting the artistic legacy of a beloved departed life partner. And what a genius job Annie did for James. Waiting for the right biographer, working on the collected, the festival, making sure that James would be read and appreciated by the next generations. Just a little bit more. During the 1990s, I had a sabbatical from Poets House, and when I got back, Annie was kind enough to let me stay at her 85th Street apartment while she was in Rhode Island. I was so excited to have coffee every morning in James Wright's orange upholstered wing chair, and I became acquainted with Annie's shelves of owl figurines because the owl was her totem. To this day and always, seeing an owl for me is not the goddess Athena. It is Annie Wright. In her last letter to me from Rhinebeck, there's a wonderful paragraph about her nieces. It begins, "My life here continues to be pleasant and quiet. I am fortunate to have two devoted nieces whom I see quite often, Nan and Laura." And then she goes on in her chatty, wonderful prose about her nieces helping with errands, fixing stuff, taking care of her plants and her technology. Then she turns directly to me and says, "I am telling you this because neither of us has children. But we do have wonderful family members, and you've shared your good times with your family. I wanted to share my very good fortune with you." So I end by thanking Laura and the whole family for caring for her so well and for giving us this evening. In every encounter I had with Annie, she shared her good fortune with grace. It was a joy to know her and watch her make a path through this life.
Thank you, Lee. And Esther Weiner. Esther Weiner? Weiner. Hi, Esther. She met Annie when they served on the board of Poets House, both at 72 Spring Street and here on River Terrace. An English faculty member at CCNY and the Sarah Lawrence Writing Institute, she is founder of the Sarah Lawrence Alumni Writers' Nights. Her 5 volumes of poetry include Transfiguration Begins at Home and In the Weather of the World. Esther Weiner.
I wasn't actually on the board of Poets House, but I came here all the time. I want to thank Laura first for inviting me today. What I think I'm talking about is love, and I'm talking about Annie. You'll hear "I loved" at the beginning of a list of gifts that she brought to me. I loved the beginning of the messages she'd leave on my voicemail. "Hi, sexy voice, it's Annie." I loved that we met through Poets House. I loved that she visited my Writer's Voice class at the West Side Y, and everyone still remembers her, and it was a really long time ago. I loved her natural elegance without an ounce of pretension in it. Loved that she'd been married to James Wright, that when they traveled together, sometimes they wrote together too. Of course, in addition to the voluminous help she gave to editing his work. Excuse me. I loved that she taught at Chapin and NYU and spent time in jail for civil rights protests. I loved the homes she'd made in New York, Rhode Island, and at Arbor Ridge. I loved the books on her bookshelves in all the homes. I loved that when she moved to Arbor Ridge in Rhinebeck, Annie, Jane, sometimes Lee, and I would go to the 18th century Beekman Arms Inn and sit in front of the fireplace for as long as was humanly possible. I loved that she published a few poems of mine in the magazine she edited at Arbor Ridge. I loved all the notes she sent me and kept every one of them. I loved her wit. I loved that she could cut through nonsense and groupthink and intimidation without ever being intimidated. I loved her pride, even when I wanted to do more for her. I guess the only thing I did love is not being able to say goodbye, so I will now.
Thank you, Esther. The kiss was lovely. Oh my, let's see. Can he turn a page? Can't stand up, but oh. Richard Lewis enjoyed working and thinking with Annie about the ways children can be encouraged and inspired to make poetry out of their instinctive imaginations and delights in the new worlds they are discovering every day. They both believe that poetry begins in childhood. In 1969, he created the Touchstone Center for Children, later partnering with the New York City Public Schools. Richard Lewis.
Thank you. I'm carrying this because sometimes when I would meet with Annie in a room full of children, I would have this knapsack. And Annie was one of the few people in the world who understood that I could walk into a room with a group of children and open this up and take my two fingers like that and open the sky and bring the sun and bring the moon and place it on a table, and we would be understood. She kind of held my hand, and what I'd like to do is just read a few things that, in a way, Annie, you see, even I'm struggling. What I'm doing is I'm struggling to take out not just what's in the briefcase here, but it's the universe. Annie understood that language right away, that this guy is not crazy. And when you're with children, you can actually have the universe in the palm of your hand. So, one of the things that, when Annie turned 90, I wrote her a letter, and it goes like this. One day, Annie, many, many years ago, when I was still first discovering the beauty and marvel of childhood and its profound poetic understanding, you pressed into my hand the beautiful poem by a 5-year-old David. As destiny would have it, his poem and your kind gesture became the true touchstone for me. And in the most marvelous of ways, your sharing of David's poem was also your continued delight and generous ability to engage and inspire others, both children and adults, to the life that is our imagining and the poetry that lies within us. And here's what she pressed into my hand. Now, I'm going to tell you one little brief reason that she did it. She was teaching kindergarten at the Walden School, which no longer exists. It was a John Dewey school, very progressive. I was hired as a 5th grade teacher without an ounce of training in being a teacher, but purely on the person who was the director of the school who said, we'll take a chance on you. I went up to the room, met all the children in the 5th grade, and I knew that Annie was down on the 1st floor with her kindergarten children. The first week, I thought I was going to die. What did I get myself into? And that's when she put into my hand this poem by David, who was 5, I believe one of her children that she was working with. And David said, "Everywhere I look, I see things. And even when I close my eyes, I still see things." Oh my God, that changed my life. It changed my life because I realized that Annie had a secret, and I had a secret in me that I hadn't quite figured out yet. That we live with our imagination, and the imagination begins in childhood. And if we can make that imagination open, oh my gosh, the world is at our fingertips, literally. Not just for us, but for those children. So I think we became friends out of the gesture of her putting that poem in my hand by that 5-year-old boy. It was inspiring to me, it has been inspiring for me for the rest of my life now. And then Annie became involved in the beginnings of Poets House when it was on Spring Street. I love the fact that Poets House began on Spring Street because to me, I imagined that it had something to do with the earth, that it was spring. There was spring in the ground, right? And water was down there. And so when I went in and I saw Annie do her work with children, I became inspired, and I asked Annie, could I give a workshop too? And so as we were working together sometimes and sometimes on our own, one of the inspirations was the earth that we were standing on, Spring Street, right? It wasn't just a name, it was a phenomena. And if we could catch that phenomena in children, their lives would be changed as well as ours. So one of the workshops that Annie gave back in April 9th, 2005, when Poets House was still in Spring Street, was called Poetry in the Children's Room, and here's the title, All the Colors Waters Can Hold with Annie Wright. And a little description of Annie. Poet and artist, Annie Wright leads a morning of watercolor painting, reading her favorite poems about water and color to inspire us. I luckily was there. I saw what happened. The room blossomed. And it blossomed because Annie had a particular way of speaking, which is when she said something, when she read a poem, when she heard a child, she would kind of bend over like this and listen. She became the child. And in becoming the child became a poet. And I can only say to you, that was the magic that not only did she share with me, but inspired me. So I thought, just as a way of appreciating something of what Annie did that moment, I would just share a few poems by children that I have found over the years that speak of air and water and light. And I'll just read them. No comment, just read them. But listen to what the children are saying. It's what Annie put her fingers out there, and as a gesture of doing it, she would always, I mentioned, bend over as if to pick a part of the earth apart, and it would become alive. So this is Desiree, who was 11 years old, who wrote, "My thought is pure creation. In it I have the earth and water and mountains." And Angie, 5th grade, said, "I feel that colors surround the air. You need to imagine that these colors do more than show. They have feelings. And when joy comes, look beyond those colors. You'll find colors surround the air. You also have to imagine when Annie heard this, she again did that wonderful moment of the gesturing with her hands as well. It was a kind of way of embracing the child, but embracing the child with a gesture that was poetic in itself. And Isabella, 8 years old, said, "My imagination is in a place where there is water and light. There is a boat, and when you see it, it stops. Then you get in it." And two more wonderful pieces by children here. Dylan, first grade, said, "Air is beauty floating about. You can't see it, but you can breathe it." And finally, another moment that was just like what Annie did for me. A child 6 years old took me by the hand in a public school up in East Harlem and said, "Richard, sit down." And I sat down the way Annie put that poem in my hand, and he said this to me: "The secret of the imagination is that the things of the universe are the things of you." That to me was what Annie was about. It was what poetry was about. It was what the imagination was about. And look where it came from. Charles, 6 years old. So I have to go into my little briefcase here. A little container here. Annie loved these kinds of things when we worked together. She loved to know that I could open a little purse like this, and somewhere in there was something magical. Well, let me show you what there is. Can you see it? It's a pebble, a little tiny pebble, such a small creature of being. Annie, again, was somebody who understood the language of the child, that a simple pebble becomes a universe. So it was simply a marvelous way of saying to both the children and to myself and to herself that we don't need much. All we need is something small, something as small as a pebble that will touch the inner life of the child. So with that in mind, there was a child that I worked with here, and I believe Annie was in the room. And I think the child was sitting right over there, and we were working with pebbles. And every child had their pebble, but if we then asked every child to open the pebble up and see what was inside that pebble. So Emma, age 7, sitting on the floor right here, said, "The moonlight seeps through the pebble. Sunlight pushes its way towards the stone. They meet in the middle and shine a song." 7 years old. Where did that come from? Well, to me, it came exactly from where Annie understood and actually began my work by putting that wonderful poem about the invisible in my hand. So I brought in a way of saying something for Annie. I brought in some pebbles for all of you. And I'm going to put them, where can I put them? I'm going to put them on the chair right here. That's what we did with children, because sometimes we put them on the floor and they get all mixed up. I'm going to put them on the chair, and I would like each one of you to take a pebble and to do exactly what Annie would have done, which is, in fact, let's go inside the pebble, let's see what's there, let's make the pebble alive. So I did read you the poem by Emma, didn't I? See, I forget sometimes. So when I forget, there's always a child out there who says, Richard, you read the poem already. So I learned the art of listening through Annie. And the art of listening was to bend over just a little bit and listen and listen and listen as if you are the child becoming the life and the words that that child had to share with you. So if you don't mind, I'll put the pebble here. I also have a piece of paper, but I'm going to let you take the pebble. And when you get home, would you write your pebble poem for Annie as a way of thanking her? So, by the way, you see how I carry my pebbles. Very important. Annie taught me that too. When you're going to carry a pebble, you have to have it in something very special. So I'll put the pebbles here. Please take the pebble and please thank Annie for being the person who made Poets House open up literally to the nature of childhood and what she did for the imagination on that level. Thank you so much. Yes, by the way, we have air, water, and light right here. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Everybody take a pebble.
Hope I have enough. There's a way of inventing it. Something like this. Open the pebble, and there is only you can see. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard Lewis, and I feel like a child again. Annie named Jonathan Blunk, James Wright's official biographer, after they met at the James Wright Festival in Martins Ferry, Ohio, James's birthplace. James Wright, A Life in Poetry, was published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux in 2017. He collaborated as co-editor with Annie and Sandra Maley in A Wild Perfection, The Selected Letters of James Wright, published by Farrar, Straus in 2005. I think Annie called herself the unofficial godmother, but we know who the godfather was. He is editor of a new edition of the complete poems to be published by Farrar Straus in 2027, the centennial of James Wright's birth. Jonathan Blunk.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Laura, and all of Laura's family who are here with us, traveling a great distance. And thank you to Poets House. And I'm really overjoyed to be here. Annie became a big part of my life and a great friendship. She was very, very generous to me with all of her time. And it was with James Wright held in her heart throughout her life after his passing. I first encountered Annie Wright, as so many of us did without realizing it, in a poem from James Wright's 1968 collection, Shall We Gather at the River. Annie had met James in the spring of 1966, but their courtship began after James invited her to his reading at the 92nd Street Y in the late November of that year. He soon called to ask her to dinner, And for that first date, Annie told me she wore a black Jackie Kennedy-like dress, and James remembered me poking my head around the door of the apartment at the end of the hall. The lights in the hallway. The lights in the hallway have been out a long time. I clasp her, terrified by the roundness of the earth and its apples and the voluptuous rings of poplar trees, the secret Africas, the children they give us. She is slim enough. Her knee feels like the face of a surprised lioness, nursing the lost children of a gazelle by pure accident. In that body I long for, the Gabon poets gaze for hours between bows toward heaven, their noble faces, too secret to weep. How do I know what color her hair is? I float among lonely animals, longing for the red spider who is God. At their third date, James Wright appeared at the door holding a button from his overcoat and looked at her plaintively, hoping that she would help him by sewing it back on. As he confessed to her months later, he had wrenched the button off his coat just before she had opened the door, a ploy to win her sympathy. More telling is that Annie, even that early in their relationship, had already guessed the truth. One of the marvelous things about their marriage, I think, is James Wright's continual amazement to realize that Annie wasn't just his equal, but in many ways surpassed him in shrewdness and empathy. By January 1967, the two frequently talked on the phone. They saw each other every other day or so. She said, he had such a deep, rich voice, and every time he'd call and say, "This is James Wright," my heart would flutter. They often went to the movies, including Dr. Zhivago, which Annie recalled as one of our more romantic dates. And then he sent me a copy of The Lights in the Hallway, and I carried it about in my purse, and I used to read it on the bus each morning, traveling to the preschool where she taught. I would call it charm, she told me, and he was very courtly, very well-mannered, and that was impressive. But it was his fantastic mind and his wonderful humor. The couple shared a great deal of laughter throughout the 13 years that they spent together. The two were married on April 29, 1967, a year and a day after they had first met. Anne always called him James, and he named her Annie. In my biography, I used the name Annie in places where it's clear that Wright was thinking of her as a muse figure. She made possible his sobriety and the last great transformation in his poetry at the end of his life, when the two began traveling together throughout Europe in the 1970s. The sense of joy Wright rediscovers in their travels is a hallmark of his final decade of poetry. One of their most beloved places in Italy was the town of Sirmione, on a spit of land that reaches into Lake Garda, which they first visited in 1973. That year, the couple also traveled a little farther up the lake, where Wright drafted the prose piece, A Small Grove in Torre del Benaco, which he included in both the chapbook, Moments of the Italian Summer in 1976, and the full-length collection, To a Blossoming Pear Tree in 1977. A Small Grove in Torre del Benaco. Outside our window, we have a small willow, and a little beyond a fig tree, and then a stone shed. Beyond the stone, the separate trees suddenly become a grove, a lemon, a mimosa, an oleander, a pine, one of the tall, slender cypresses that a poet here once called candles of darkness that ought to be put out in winter, another willow, and a pine. She stands among them in her flowered green clothes. Her skin is darker gold than the olives in the morning sun. 2 hours ago, we got up and bathed in the lake. It was like swimming in a vein. Everything that can blossom is blossoming around her now. She is the eye of the grove, the eye of mimosa and willow. The cypress behind her catches fire. One of the things that delights me about this poem is the marvelous feeling of shared experience, even communion that comes with Wright's use of those plural pronouns. Outside our window, we have a small willow. It was D.H. Lawrence who first called the cypresses candles of darkness. And there is also an echo of Catullus, who referred to his beloved Sirmione as the eye of all peninsulas and islands. Here, Annie can prompt everything around her to blossom, becoming the muse that Wright had been searching for and trying to invent his whole life. Annie was a creative force in her own right, not just a marvelous teacher, but also a writer of wide accomplishment and sensitivity. We first see this side of her in The Summers of James and Annie Wright, a chapbook published in 1981 that includes some of James Wright's last prose pieces, together with an equal number written by Anne. The two always returned to the same pensione in Sirmione, and during their last long stay there throughout the month of June 1979, they would begin their day looking out their second-floor window to search for the large, ancient turtle that lived in a private garden next door. This was a time of extraordinary productivity for James Wright, as he revised and arranged the poems that would prove to be his posthumous collection, This Journey. But as they prepared to leave Sirmione, a shadow had begun to creep into their enchanted time in Italy. As we can see in this prose piece written by Annie that has the title, June 26th. This morning is quiet and calm. James opens the shutters and says, "There's a beautiful mist over everything, and the turtle is out." The turtle is out, picking his way over the grass on his bandy legs, holding his head awkwardly high, stopping now and then to eat a blade of grass. A pearl gray lake rises to a pearl gray sky. The water is so clear that pale shapes of rocks show below the surface for the first time. A few swallows sweep through the cool air. Birds sing in cypress and olive trees over in the public park. From our window, I see fish gliding over the rocks near the dock of Pensione Anna. Small groups of tiny olive-colored fish dart quickly. Larger fish glide leisurely. 4 hurry the pace. Silver flashes break the gray as piccolini surface for insects. A man comes from the direction of the beach, paddling a red kayak. A strange bird with a white feathered mask and a white banded tail hops on and off the big rock by the steps of the dock. The sun burns a ragged hole in the mist, spreading a glittering red stain on the pale gray water. Spots of gold quiver on a patch of water near the rock and the bird. It is the last morning. The lingering sore throat that James complained of upon their return to New York City in early September would not be diagnosed as cancer until the last week in November, and it soon became clear that surgery was no longer an option. Following his death on March 25, 1980, Anne began a new and even more challenging part of her life at the age of 51. She would go on to edit her husband's poems and letters for publication and write dozens of essays and recollections of their years together. My friendship with Annie began in 1990 when I first interviewed her, and my wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Emma, enjoyed her marvelous company for the rest of her long and eventful life. Beginning in 1999, we would visit with her in Misquamicut, Rhode Island every summer, and she became truly a godmother to my daughter, Emma, who had her own close friendship with Annie. After she asked me to write the authorized biography of James, my family and I traveled with Annie to Italy and to France, where Emma shared a room with her, and I pestered Annie with my microphone countless times as we revisited the places that she had traveled to with James. I'm proud to say that she was overjoyed with the book that I wrote, and that's the best review the book has received. What I cherish most is the sound of her laughter and the twinkle in her eye. Annie had a great gift for friendship, as I'm sure you understand. And her sense of right and wrong was very, very strong. Thankfully, she had a marvelous memory and a wicked wit. In the history of American literature, no one has shown more devotion to securing the legacy of a writer's work. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Laura Lee DeCinque and Karen East, devoted and much loved nieces of Annie, were so very important to her. She was like their other mother, Laura Lee DeCinque and Karen East.
First, I want to say thank you to everyone for coming. This has just been, she would be thrilled. Thank you. Before I speak, we have someone on Zoom. My brother, Thomas Lee, is in England, staying up late. Hello, Tom. And he sent me some words that he would love to share with you. On Edie, a French restaurant, and chocolate mousse. In my early years, I lived in New Jersey with modest horizons and an unrefined palate. One of my great treats in those days was to visit on Edie in New York City. Edie put a lot of effort into my visiting, which included the strict requirement to visit at least one museum and some nice meals. I loved those visits and fell in love with the old Frick Museum, which Thomas just visited last summer. It was my favorite, and I took little persuasion to go. It felt like I was visiting a very rich man who had just stepped out. The artwork was so awesome. Sadly for me, the renovations turned a rich man's house that had lots of great art into an amazing art gallery into a fine old house. But I digress. On one particular weekend stay, we spent the afternoon at the Met, an American wonder to be sure, but a place that requires some stamina. We then returned to her apartment to get ready to go out for dinner. I asked Edie if we could go to McDonald's. And those of you who knew Edie would probably know the milk-curdling look I got. Right, Josh? She informed me that we would not be doing McDonald's. Instead, we would be eating at a nice French restaurant. I attempted resistance. Quote, French food is weird, and Nancy says they eat frog's legs. It fell on deaf ears. She did give in a little. If you eat the meal and you're still hungry, we'll finish at McDonald's. Thus, I was reassured, and off we went. What a meal it was, 60 plus years ago, and I still remember it. We were treated like minor royalty as soon as we entered. The service and the food were both amazing. I can't recall the entree and main, but it was very good and served with due deference to young sir. I loved it. The piece de la resistance, though, was dessert. Chocolate mousse, which was actually Auntie's most favorite dessert. Well, maybe creme brulee. It was like nothing I had ever tasted. I was in heaven, impossibly rich, dark, and silky. It was utterly amazing. I can literally still taste it today. We left and did not visit McDonald's, at least not that night. Edie opened my eyes to the world of culture, to beauty, and the transformative power of chocolate mousse. I miss her. Hello, Tom. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight and to celebrate a very special woman. Annie, or Edie, or Auntie, as my family called her, would be delighted to know that all of you have gathered here in person, or there's some people via Zoom tonight, not simply to remember her, but to celebrate the connections, the friendships, and the relationships that meant so much to her throughout her life. Thanks to all of you who have already shared your memories and reflections about her, and I want to say a big thank you and a shout out to Jane Preston and their staff. You guys have been just so wonderful. And to Sander, not Sanders, Zuloff, your help and incredible support, actually all these months, have just made this evening's program possible, and we have spent a lot of time on the phone just talking and reminiscing, and it's just been wonderful. And Jeff Katz back there from Rhinebeck really did an amazing job on the slideshow. If you haven't seen it, we're gonna see it again afterwards. Jeff was also incredibly helpful to me and to Karen at the end of Annie's life, when we had to sort through an awful lot of how many books? 1,500 books that we actually donated, quite a few. But we also packed up, I think it was 16 cartons of wonderful materials that are now at the University of Minnesota that have joined their archives, and could not have done it without you. Thank you. So Annie was known by so many people, as you know, as you heard tonight, in so many different ways. That really became clear to me when during her last few years, she would say that the correspondence was piling up and mounting up, and I was trying to help her kind of sort through some of her correspondence, which, for those of you who received how many letters, you know that was so important to her. And it was daunting. She had 19 file drawers filled with correspondence that I needed to go through, and they were all labeled meticulously, and there are many of your names on folders in there. I haven't gone through them all yet, but she saved every letter that came to her, every single letter, every note card, every holiday greeting. If you sent her a newspaper clipping, I have it, and a magazine article, and every book. But not only that, she saved your letter. She then made a copy of her response to you, and then the next exchange after that. So if you have any secrets out there, I've got them. So as I started to look through as many of the letters as I could, and just know that they're now in climate-controlled storage, which we had to get a storage unit for all of this, I came to appreciate the connections that she made throughout her life. So whether you were a colleague or a college roommate, a fellow lover of poetry, a student, a neighbor, or a physician, she didn't just simply get to know you. She became part of your lives, as we felt tonight, and part of their families. So here's an example. I took her to a doctor appointment in Rhinebeck, and I found her right away asking the Dr. Pappas very detailed questions about her trip to Italy, the recent trip she had just had, and it was clear they had discussed this before. So she also asked her about her eldest daughter's college experience. Of course, she knew the child's name. So when we left, we, of course, were gifted with a basket of tomatoes, not tomatoes, tomatoes, that the doctor had brought just for her. So that was just an example of the incredible connection. She really had a remarkable gift for connecting, I think some of you had said this, with people in a really personal way. So 3 little stories that I'll share with you that are personal. Our younger son, my husband Greg, and I, Spencer, was a very avid athlete in school, grade school and high school, and he excelled in soccer, especially football. 2 activities which, Annie did not know very much about, but she never said she didn't care about it. She just knew very little about it, but she made it her mission to learn. So she researched and found out what a running back was. And then she brought him this massive football anthology, huge book. And the 2 of them sat together in his bedroom floor, and he walked her through various plays and football teams and explained to her the game, and she listened and she helped him. They turned the pages together. It was just beautiful. And then our eldest son, Ryan, she took his poetry and his artwork very seriously. So she encouraged him to send him some of his art and his writing. She offered really thoughtful feedback. She proudly framed one of his early portrait works in her apartment and one of his poems in her apartment. And then she invited him to a poetry event when he was about 16. And to his amazement, he was prepared for it. He was asked to introduce her infamous Billy Collins. So one last story. When our boys were about 5 and 9 years old, I picked them up from school along with 2 of Spencer's little classmates. And the 2 little boys were in the back with our boys, and they were talking about Christmas plans and how their grandmas were coming to visit. And in my rearview mirror, I could see my 2 boys looking at each other, and Spencer said, "Well, we have a grandma too, but her name's Auntie." So that's what she was to our family. So she may have been our aunt, a cousin, a friend, colleague, mentor, but to many of us, she filled a role that went far beyond any title. She loved deeply. She took a genuine interest in people's lives, and she made each of us feel seen, valued, and important. And what a gift that was, and what a legacy that leaves behind. She also left me a very special gift, and that's the opportunity to continue the stewardship of the works of her beloved husband, my Uncle James, our Uncle James. Those are tremendously big shoes to fill. And I'm grateful for the trust that she's given me, and I'm going to do my very best to honor that, but I'm going to have some help, Mr. Galassi, and then Susanna Tamminen at Wesleyan Press, and of course, Jonathan. So I look forward to continuing our partnerships as we work together to preserve and advance the literary legacy of Annie and James. Thank you. The other beloved cousin and beloved nephew.
Yes. I'm the other niece, Karen, the other niece. I as I usually do, last minute, writing down my thoughts of Annie because I was trying to think how do I put into writing what she meant to me and in my life, because it seems like she's always been there from the very beginning, and in fact I think she felt like she gave birth to me. I was my father taught at the American School of Japan in Tokyo, and if you know, Annie taught at the American School in Italy in Florence, so they had that in common. And so she came to visit us in Tokyo, and I don't know, I must have been maybe 2 years old when she first met me, but I just don't ever remember a time that she was never a part of my life, and she just, I wrote this stuff down, and I don't know that I'm going to even speak of anything that I wrote here, because when I was reading it and all of you guys were talking, you spoke so eloquently, and I'm reading my stuff and I'm like, this is the driest piece of crap I've ever read, and how can you say this about somebody that you love so much? But you know, she was my fairy godmother. She was my second mother. She was my counselor. She was my sounding board. She was my everything. Laura was born 2 weeks after me. I think it was within 2 weeks. We're actually sisters. We're not cousins. We didn't come from the same mother, but we really truly are sisters. Annie was the oldest of the 3 sisters. She never had kids, but she took us on as daughters, and she raised us as her daughters. And unfortunately, our mothers were very jealous of that relationship. And so whenever we acted up, and there was a time, and I will tell this story because it was when I've been sober for 22 years, so Uncle James and I had that in common, and she was very proud of my sobriety, but this was when I was still drinking, and I was not speaking to my mother for like about a month and a half. I had this huge huge fight with my mother, and I'd stopped speaking to her. And so Aunt Edie was the intermediary when I was not speaking. And so my mom called Aunt Edie and she said, Karen is not speaking to me and you've got to call her. And so Aunt Edie called me, and she was kind of half afraid to talk to me because, of course, I was a true alcoholic and very vicious on the phone. And so she's like, well, Karen, your mom is very upset with you, and it is Christmas time, and you need to make up with her. And she went through this whole thing, and she wasn't getting through to me. And finally, I could tell she was getting frustrated. And finally, I said, okay, I'll call her. And she said, here's what I want you to do. And I said, okay. And she said, I want you to get off the phone. And I said, okay. And she said, I want you to go to the kitchen. I said, okay. And she said, I want you to pour a shot of whiskey. And I said, okay. She said, take that shot of whiskey. I said, okay. Drink it and then call the bitch and say you're sorry. So I took her advice. So that's what I did. And I did. I called the bitch and I said I was sorry, and I did what my Aunt Edie told me to do. So from the very beginning, it was the three amigos. It was Laura, Edie, and myself, and we did trips together. We did everything together. I was blessed when Uncle James was, as Jonathan talked about, I was here when we moved him over to hospice, and was that day that we moved him over, and it was me and Donald Hall when we it was a wonderful day, sad occasion, of course, but to see the relief finally in her face as she was going through that horrible, horrible situation in her life, and to see the peace in Uncle James's face, it's indescribable, and I know a lot of us have gone through that with relatives, but to be a part of that was an honor, and I've gone through happy times with her and sad times, and of course living in Wyoming, couldn't be close to her, but I always felt like she was just a phone call away. We did have the pleasure of coming out here in January, when we were getting ready to move her to Rhinebeck, and she asked us to try to, help her get ready to pack and winnow some of her stuff down. And I think we were able to winnow some of her stuff down to just 2 boxes because she wouldn't let us get rid of anything. And then finally, when she passed and we saw all of the stuff. She wasn't the only prolific writer in our family. We found letters that our grandparents wrote to each other and great-grandparents wrote to each other. And she kept all of that. So she was the family historian, and thank God for that. I think every family needs it, but I loved her. Just did. So.
And finally, Madeline Zuloff is speaking to us this evening through her poetry. And she may not be speaking to me ever again. Her work graces the covers of James Wright's complete poems, Above the River, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux in cooperation with Wesleyan in 1990. We shared so many moments with Annie at her New York apartment, at her summer cottage, which she called the right place. And I first heard James read at Indiana University, and I was a student there, Philip Appelman's. Annie accompanied James when he came to read his poetry at the County College of Morris in 1974, and when he returned as our concluding poet in our 1976 bicentennial poetry series. This is a poem I wrote as a memorial apostrophe to James. And it was republished this spring with a new dedication in memory of them both. Your chair in Misquamicut, in memoriam James Wright, 1927, 1980, and Annie Wright, 1929, 2025. Annie hands me your chair this morning, unfolding it into bright sunlight and heavy dew, and you join us under Giotto blue skies, hung out to dry after last night's thunder showers. Your spirit rebukes suffering and memory, and you're cheered by the ease of the cricket's sweet babbling, the chickadee's frenetic, reedy singing of its name. The one dark velvety violet poking wild through the patio's pebbles, the fruits of one more summer, ripening and gone. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, portulacas, marigold, scaevola, tuberous begonia, petals parted and pollen milked by burly longshoremen, crawling into balsam, into zucchini flowers, their legs laden with living gold, flying off to another, again, another. That pair of cardinals relishing the cantaloupe seeds Annie's thrown under the feeder for them to share with the mockingbirds. Your chair, the brackets rusted now, webbing shredded and hanging down under a new canvas cover fastened to the aluminum frame. Poetry strong enough to hold us throughout this lifetime's sacrament of praise. Thank you all very much. The last time I spoke with Annie, her aide said to me, Annie's having a bad day. You can't talk to her now. And I said, would Annie like to listen? I'd like to read her a James Wright poem. And she said, okay. And I said, do you have any particular one? And I had the complete poems. And she said, I want to hear Yes, But. So I read it, and I found out just 2 weeks ago from Laura that James wrote that poem for her. Thank you all for being here. It's been a pleasure to introduce so many wonderful people. Thank you.